Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of our conservation conversations with Danielle and Moe, and today we're talking about greenwashing and misinformation.
Yeah, so Moe, let's jump right into it. I know this is a topic of conversation that we both really like to discuss. So can you clarify for our listeners again sort of what is the difference between greenwashing and misinformation?
Absolutely.
And how do they play with each other?
Yeah. Greenwashing is more company or product specific, where you're trying to mask a product to be more environmentally friendly than it actually is. Misinformation, it doesn't have to be a company or a product, but it's more about the topic itself, and it's deliberate in trying to deceive or confuse people around a certain topic, which muddies the waters when we start talking about actual environmental solutions.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, they kind of interplay in the sense that with enough greenwashing, it starts building this distrust in the community. And some people who want to take advantage of that, they can use that to create misinformation to further polarize people on certain topics.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I find a little frustrating in this whole topic area is that it's similar to greenwashing in the sense that they're choosing to give you certain information while withholding other information. So there can be a kernel of truth in misinformation, but they conflate it in such a way that it no longer truly represents their claims that they're making. Do you want to maybe speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. We saw a lot of that at the early days of the climate movement, like when Inconvenient Truth first came out. There was a lot of discussion between, or misunderstanding around weather versus climate. Mm-hmm. And that even though there could be some facts within the misinformation, it's not painting the full picture. It's not, and that specific fact they're pulling out is deliberately there to try to deceive you on the rest of the information, or try to
confuse you.
Yeah, it's really trying to confuse you.
With the example with like weather and climate, with like climate change or global warming, people will be like, oh, well, it's the coldest winter I've ever experienced in my life. Like, that's really interesting. Like, that even using the term global warming set back the advocacy around climate change quite a bit, because people couldn't sort of conceptualize the difference between the two. So how as consumers do we, or even people like in the community, what are some strategies that companies use and how can we spot them?
I think the most common example is cherry picking data. So when you think of like cherry picking data is when you have a system as a whole and you take one specific instance to create doubt in everything. So for example, like an East Coast example, and which happened in New Brunswick is here, it was when Hurricane Fiona hit in 2022.
That was wild.
Right? And the top headline after Hurricane Fiona hit was that, the wind turbines in New Brunswick produced zero wind energy. It was
too much wind.
There was it was too windy to produce any energy. So what I investigated that claim, and what I found out was that Kent Hills was offline way before the storm because of maintenance issues.
Oh, wow.
Some of the turbines had cracked bases, so it wasn't even online during the storm to begin with. But just to push it a bit further, I decided to call every single wind farm operator in Atlantic Canada, and turns out more than 80% of them were online and producing electricity during the storm. So, but that one news story that was the headlines in New Brunswick, it creates so much distrust and doubt into wind as a viable option, because oh my God, when it's the stormiest day, it's not there.
It doesn't work when there's no wind. It doesn't work when there's too much wind.
Right, but that wasn't what happened at all. It wasn't even online. So it deliberately creating that mistrust and deliberately conflating an issue to kind of muddy the waters in terms of actually discussing tangible, real solutions. Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed around misinformation that it kind of really frustrates me as an individual is when there is like a false equivalence, when they're giving as much merit to, say, one scientist who disagrees. Let's use the anti-vaxxing movement in the 90s, early 2000s, where one scientist said, oh, mumps and measles, the vaccination, it causes autism. And then there was a celebrity, it got backed by celebrity, and it caused a lot of people to not vaccinate their children, which we're still seeing the health effects of today. Why do people give that one scientist as much merit as the other scientists who showed that there was no, or at least had many papers that showed there wasn't a link?
You bring up a good point. I mean, false equivalency is another type of misinformation. And in that specific case, it was Andrew Wakefield was the scientist. He's been discredited now. But at that time, his one article was about how mumps and measles, that vaccine can cause autism in children. And despite that one paper saying that, there were already thousands of papers kind of already published disproving that there's any link between them. And because of that paper, in fact, there had to be 1,000 more articles to really confirm that there is no link. But when it came to the media presented that one article and gave it an equal platform as the thousands of articles that have already disproven this. So from the public's perspective, they're seeing kind of an equal debate between the two topics, even though they're not equal at all in the scientific community. And especially when you have a celebrity backing up that misinformation, it spreads further. And what happens is now you kind of have that mistrust with the public on scientists because that confusion was generated from them. So I think false equivalency is very frustrating. And personally for me, I remember when I first started doing policy work, I was in Ontario and I was working to get neonicotinoids, a certain type of pesticide, banned in Ontario. And there were already hundreds and hundreds of papers already published, mainly from Europe, who's already banned this pesticide, by the way, right away, that showed the link between neonicotinoids and bees and how that would affect. And when I brought it to the Ontario legislature, the first thing they said is, well, there's this one paper that says there is no link. And when I looked at that paper, it's funded by the pharmaceutical company who produced that pesticide. So it's kind of like I have to spend all that time disproving that one article when there's already hundreds and hundreds of papers backing up my claim already. So it's like that time I need to spend to disprove fringe theories. I don't want to spend my time like that, but unfortunately that's what I have to do.
I think that comes down to the whole, maybe not misunderstanding, but difficulty of comprehending sort of the way that scientific methodology works. Like, as an ecologist who's trained to study different systems, it even took myself a long time. Like, I have a master's degree, and it took me that long to really understand that science can never really prove or disprove anything. It's always getting to the best possible conclusion. So do you want to dive into a little bit of how that dynamic plays in misinformation?
It's one of the reasons why misinformation can be so easy, because scientists, they're very accurate in the sense that you can't prove or disprove anything at 100%. Right? All you can do is gather as much evidence, as much fact, as much research that leads you to a certain idea or theory. So whenever you hear, we have something that's, 99% accurate or 99.9% accurate, there's always, what about that 1% or 0.1%? What about that other side of the story, right? And to simplify things, like if you have a red ball and you ask, or you have a ball and you ask 100 people what color is the ball, and 99 of them say it's red, and one person says it's blue, and then now the media says the ball could be red or blue, right? And so it creates confusion. And the fact that since science, they're very careful with their language and they're never saying anything is 100% right, it just makes it so that people creating misinformation, they can kind of take advantage of that and be like, there is
that little shadow
of a doubt. And this is most common in terms of like climate modeling, for example. Climate modeling is a model, right? It's never going to be exact. It's never going to be perfect. You can't predict the future anyway, right? But what you have is thousands of scientists all over the world with their own models, all reaching the same conclusion. Right. And even though if the variables are not perfect, they improve them every year and they're still getting similar conclusions. But you could have one person who makes a model that doesn't fit that. So now that doubt gets created, and models will never be perfect to begin with, but they do it should help in progressing the conversation, whereas what we're seeing is delays because, you can't trust anything anymore,
Right.
So that's what you're saying.
So a lot of this misinformation comes with distrust, but we also, on the flip side, kind of see misinformation showing up with false solutions as well. So we see, for example, natural gas. So you have, in fact, there is a kernel of truth. Natural gas is better than crude oil. Even in the language, it shows it. But in all reality, we're still extracting it. It is coming from the ground, so it is natural. So there is these kernels of truth, but they're not really giving us the whole story. Do you want to talk about how that works?
Absolutely. With misinformation, you do bring in a lot of the false solutions. And for example, we're hearing all this talk about trying to get to a net zero electricity grid by 2035. And you hear, coal is the most emitting source of energy. It has crazy bad health effects, so we need to phase off coal. And you have one side where vast majority of scientists and people who want, cleaner energy, wind, solar, backed up with, some storage. Whereas you have other people who are saying, those cost a lot, and muddying the waters and say, hey, you know what emits less than coal? Natural gas. And it's natural, it's just in the ground, even though it has the same effects. Because everything's getting so confused and getting just trying to delay things, you just try to default to those kinds of false solutions that have been made.
So it seems like language really matters, and
it does.
And unfortunately, we can be taken advantage of using language. So how is this particular topic, misinformation, really impacting our society? What is the end game of the misinformation?
Well, misinformation, what the main point is trying to prey on people's emotions, prey on people's fear, concerns, and issues. And what ends up happening is that with the more and more misinformation you put into the system, you are polarizing topics, and you're pitting people against each other, and creating doubt and in any topic, and with an effort to delay certain policy actions, especially with the climate and environmental movement, where we're trying to get the ball rolling and get things done sooner rather than later, in an effort to not only be more environmentally friendly, but save costs in the long run. But with this misinformation, you can kind of separate those issues and say economics and environment don't mix.
Yeah.
And we need to do a more, what I call a false solution first, before we can get to that idealistic end goal that they try to claim. So I think preying on people's fears and those emotions is the goal to delay real action.
Yeah, it does seem like misinformation has a really good knack of fear mongering. We see this at the federal level with the carbon tax. Axe the tax, it's catchy, and they seem to be saying, oh, the carbon tax is the reason we're having all of these problems. For example, with groceries, it seems like companies are blaming the carbon tax on the increased cost of fuel, which will increase the cost of groceries, but we also do know there's been legal battles over price fixing, over price gouging over the pandemic, and us not really seeing those prices go down. So it does seem to be almost on purpose that they're kind of utilizing this fear mongering.
Yeah, oversimplification and constant blaming is kind of another misinformation tactic in a sense, where you have the carbon tax, which I get it, nobody wants to pay because the affordability crisis is at an all-time high. But when you take the grocery example, we're well aware these are monopolies, and they've been price fixing for quite some time, price gouging, and the most obvious example is the pandemic. During the pandemic, while everyone else was struggling to pay their bills, these grocery stores made record profits. And as soon as the pandemic ends, they don't want those profit margins to decrease. So what do? They just blame the carbon tax, right? That's what's leading to all this price increase. So that oversimplification of the issue, and then putting all the blame on something else as if that's going to resolve it, it leads to misinformation. Now everyone's holding on to that, and that's where a lot of this divide and polarization comes from, taking advantage of people's emotions.
What is the impact on our society of misinformation?
The impact is first and primarily like polarizing people against each other, that distrust between people and government and people and utilities and companies.
I mean, we're seeing that all over social media.
Yeah, you're seeing it.
And the States especially.
Yeah, and the biggest effect is it's delaying real action and real solutions. Because now people like me and other scientists and other policy analysts, we have to spend a lot of time looking at these false solutions and trying to spend more time discrediting them, even though they're already discredited, rather than focusing on something more meaningful. So delaying action, it always hurts the people, right? You're not benefiting the economy by delaying certain projects. You're not benefiting the system by delaying, yeah.
And it does seem really difficult to spot misinformation. Do you want to give us a couple of quick tips before we wrap up
absolutely.
on our talk today?
Yeah. Some tips I would say is check the source of where this information is coming from. And after you check the source, kind of verify it with other sources. See if other news agencies are saying it, but specifically check trusted institutions like NASA or the International Panel on Climate Change. You can also, when you're reading news articles, be wary of oversimplification or be wary...
With emotionally charged
exactly. Be wary of emotionally charged statements that are saying like, hey, all your problems can be solved by getting rid of something, blaming something else. So just be a bit... Everything is a lot more complicated than we give it credit for. And if you keep blaming something else and simplifying other things, we're not going to really get anywhere.
Thanks, Mo. I know you're working on a pretty special project here at Conservation Council. Just as we're wrapping up, do you want to let our audience know
absolutely.
What's coming up?
Yeah, we're starting a new page called tellthefacts.ca, which is going to try to combat some of this misinformation. So we're going to put up some articles that have misinformation in them and try to fact check them, and we're going to have a submission portal where if you find misinformation you can send it to us and we can try to add it to the website. So
Amazing.
We're really trying to combat that.
That sounds really cool. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks so much for your time today,
No
and
problem.
I think we're going to wrap up.